Hello, good evening. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I'm Pat Riley. I'm with the Solas NUA board and the Capital Irish Film Festival, the first weekend in March every year at AFI. Enough shameless plugs. Tonight's event is a co-production of NYU in Washington, D.C., Solas NUA, and the Embassy of Ireland. It is a screening of Keepers of the Flame, and it is part of the 7th Annual European Month of Culture. On behalf of Solas NUA, I want to thank Tom McIntyre, who is the Director of External Affairs here at NYU, who founded and directed the DC Dialogues, of which this is a part. And also Polly Terzian, who is the program coordinator, without whom we could not do this. And they always make us all feel welcome here at the Abramson Family Auditorium. The film tonight will be followed by a discussion of the Irish Civil War and its effects with Tom Meagher and Colleen Parsons. Timothy Meagher is Associate Professor Emeritus, Catholic University of America. He studies American immigration and ethnic history. His specialty is the history of Irish Americans. His publications on that topic include Inventing Irish America, Generation Class and Ethnic Identity in a New England City, 1880 to 1928. He was co-editor with Ronald Baer of the New York Irish. Colleen Parsons is Associate Professor of English and co-director of Global Irish Studies at Georgetown University, where he has taught since 2012. His book, The Ordnance Survey and Modern Irish Literature, won the American Conference for Irish Studies Robert Rhodes Prize for Books on Literature. Before the film, they have agreed to come up here and give us some brief context on the war whose aftermath this film discusses. Tim? Colleen?
As I said, I'm an historian of Irish America. That doesn't mean that I know everything about Ireland. And there's probably a lot of people in the audience who know a lot about this topic. But I'll give a brief kind of outline, and we will have an opportunity to talk about it later on. Basically, this Irish Civil War begins, well, that's a good question as to when it begins. But why? Let's begin with why it begins. It's a fight over the meaning of the treaty, or the treaty that was signed in December 1921. There were a couple issues, but the big issue, the most important one, was the treaty required an oath to the king. Some people objected to that. Republicans believed in a republic. The notion of republic went back to the United Irishmen of 1790s, and it also was very important to the Fenians. It had something, meaning we're a republic. Almost every country in the world today calls itself a republic. But it had a real meaning about, in those days, not just independence, but also kind of about aristocracy and monarchy. The Fenians used to say that what they stood for is that every man could look another in the eye. In other words, not be deferential. And so the republic has real meaning here. And the question was whether they would get a republic or not. Who's on which side? There's been a lot of historical scholarship trying to figure out what kinds of class groups supported either side, or where, or geographically. Geographically, it appears that, but not entirely, that the people towards the west are more supportive of the Republicans, the IRA, the anti-treaty, and people to the east are more supportive of the Free State government and the treaty. There's a lot of work on class, but it's none of it. It's a lot of recent work has made it much more complicated which classes would have supported it. When does it begin? That's a good question. One could say the Army, the IRA council meets in March of 1922, but it would be probably the taking over of the four courts in April 14th, 1922, and also other buildings in downtown city center of Dublin, a kind of in symbolic reenactment of 1916. But you could also say it's when the Free State government bombards the four courts that the war begins. It proceeds for another year or so and ends in the spring of 1923 with its victory by the Free State. What are the effects? For Ireland, one of the effects is the structure of Irish politics now, the partisan structure, the Fine Gael and against Fianna Fáil. That structure is a product of the Civil War, although some people would see other things as shaping that as well. In terms of Irish America, just to get a little plug in here for Irish America, it really does mean the end of Irish American nationalism for a generation. Irish Americans don't understand the Civil War, and they kind of retreat from nationalism and won't come back to it in any really big numbers or reasonably big numbers until the 1960s. Colleen.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Pat, for inviting us and for hosting this event. I just add to Tim. I'm a scholar of English literature, and despite what my partner says, I think a lot about feelings and emotions. And so this is a period of Irish history that is very little spoken about. My own grandfather would have fought in the Civil War. He marched into Beggar's Bush Barracks to take over from the British on the 2nd of February 1922, which is the day that Ulysses was published. And he would have fought in the war. I know nothing about it. He died in the 1950s and never spoke to my father about the Civil War. And that's a running theme, I think, throughout Ireland's dealing with the Civil War. We're now coming up on the centenary of the Civil War, 1922 to 1923, at the very end of a very, very long decade of centenaries in Ireland, and I think it will be the most difficult centenary. I don't know if the word celebrate is the word I'm looking for, but it's very much unspoken of. Of course, at the time, there were people who did write about it, and if you all know anything about W.B. Yeats, it should be that he was really the greatest chronicler of this really deeply ambivalent, deeply difficult period from the Easter Rising in 1916 through the War of Independence and onto the Civil War. And he wrote a poem, he wrote a few poems about the Civil War. One of them is relatively well-known, Meditations at Time of Civil War. You probably recognize these lines: "We had fed the heart on fantasies, and the heart's grown brutal from the fair." Well, there's another line later, or earlier in the poem, rather, and I'll read this to you. It's less well-known. Yeats writes, this is a poem, the Stairs Nest at my window. Yeats writes, "Somewhere a man is killed, or a house burned, yet no clear facts to be discerned." That's a classic Yeatsian. Somewhere, I'm not sure, something happens, a man is killed, a house is burned, no clear facts. And I think that carries over to today, the idea of there being no clear facts, and you'll hear a lot about it in the film. Part of the reason that there are no clear facts is that truth was a casualty of war, but a very real casualty of the Civil War, because in the four courts were the National Archives. A very significant amount of the National Archives were in the four courts and lost during the Civil War. So truth and memory become casualties. Again, you'll hear Dermot Ferreter saying that. There are a couple of other writers I'll just mention one maybe, Sean O'Casey. I don't know if you know the play Juno and the Paycock. So the war finished sometime in the late spring, early summer, again, quite unclear, of 1923. In March 1924, the Abbey Playhouse put on a Sean O'Casey play, Juno and the Paycock. 9 months, more or less, after the war ended, O'Casey was writing a tragicomedy about the war, and a tragicomedy that's filled with the idea of the bitter word. It's a play that's filled with the bitterness of the Civil War, that's going to come out when you hear these accounts of how people respond to the Military Service Commission. So that's really all I wanted to say, is to give you a sense of the lasting impact of those difficult days, and the fact that at the forefront of describing those are Yeats and Sean O'Casey and other writers, among whom Ernie O'Malley, who fought in the Civil War and then moved here to New Mexico, hung out with George O'Keeffe, That too is a legacy. O'Malley's writing On Another Man's Wound is a legacy of a very deep time that produced an extraordinary flourishing of quite complex literature. So I suppose I'll say enjoy the film.
Thank you, and once again, we're going to have a short discussion by Timothy Meagher and Colleen Parsons. Timothy is Professor Emeritus, Catholic University, and Colleen Parsons is Associate Professor of English and Co-Director of Global Irish Studies at Georgetown University. Gentlemen?
Well, I thought it was a kind of wonderful movie in a lot of ways. It's a very important issue. I was trying to think, and this is probably not relevant, but it's what I know. The kind of what's the correlate to Irish American history, and I guess since my own people are all famine generation people, I had two great-grandfathers who fought in the Civil War. And those of you who do genealogy or know about genealogy, the American Civil War pensions are a kind of critical resource for people learning about average people. Historian Damian Shields has published a book on that, on stories. So that's one kind of parallel. The other parallel is that the history of Irish Americans in the Civil War was a history that was made over time, and that process of making that history is a really kind of interesting phenomenon because Irish Americans, on the whole, in the North, were not very strong supporters of the cause of abolition, but 150,000 Irish immigrants did fight in the Civil War, and some fought with great distinction. So there's some kinds of parallels there. But that would be what I have to say. Do you want to pick up, Colleen?
It's not often you see a biopic of an archive. Quite a fancy biopic, some lovely pictures, soft focus shots of boxes. But in a sense, it's, there is a lot of archivists have written, you'll know this, being an archivist, about the pleasure of archives and the pleasure of those boxes and the fact that what's in them is, the archivist who spoke at the very beginning, whose name I missed, she spoke about it being a sliver. There's another South African historian or theorist of archives, Vern Harris, who talks about archives being a sliver of history. And in a sense, you see in these boxes, what they are these deeply personal stories from hundreds and thousands of families who were affected by the war. I was touched by the numbers. 85,000 people applied for a pension, only 18,000 were successful. And thinking about each one of those letters being an appeal to a state that many of those people did not support. So those who found themselves on the anti-treaty, anti-state side in the Civil War were writing to the state to say, I want you to recognize and to hear my history. But of all of those, almost 70,000, they got the answer, what is it? I wrote it down. The Act does not appear to apply. There's a sort of a gentle generosity, in a sense, in that word. Like, who designed that stamp? It doesn't say the Act does not apply. It says the Act does not appear to apply. And I think there is a recognition of some of the really difficult politics of the Civil War. Whatever about 1916, and you can say who came out, the phrase is you would come out, who came out and who didn't come out. And in the War of Independence, it was even more organized. There was there was a sort of an apparatus of the shadow state. But at the Civil War, particularly on the anti-treaty side, there was very little bureaucratic apparatus to help people actually define themselves as being combatants in a war. I realized at the beginning we didn't give you a sense of the numbers involved in the Civil War. We don't know how many people died in the Civil War. It was somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000. 4 is probably too high, so somewhere between 2 and 3, I think, is the general number now. But the very fact that we don't know who died. And I should say that W.T. Cosgrave, who was the president of the provisional government, said during the Civil War, he said, if 10,000 die, it will be worth it. As the state executed 81 people and as thousands of others died. So these are documents, they're boxes that tell a very difficult story, but very moving. I was really moved by the story of the Tracy's mother who got £100 and sent it back. And then she got £150 and she sent it back. The maximum you could get was £150 per annum. And I was moved by the dignity of that response to the state. Those were really my thoughts. I would say I had one little quibble with one of the experts, but I'm not an expert. Monchalm McGann, at the very end, called this two sides fighting over their visions for Ireland. I don't know, Tim, do you think that's true, that the Civil War... So we had 1916, everybody who was involved had hearts with one purpose alone, as Yeats wrote. The War of Independence, not just those involved, but most of the country had hearts with one purpose alone. And Civil War was quite divided, but I don't know that they were divided over a vision. I think they were divided over tactics. Would that be true?
A strategy for somehow getting through. Colin says, this may not be the ultimate freedom, but it gives us a chance to get to the ultimate freedom. It's an opportunity we don't have. We have to face the hard realities of this. Most people do think Britain would not yield on the issue of the oath. I hope that was clear. That maybe I didn't make it as clear before. That the oath, taking that oath, was the kind of cause of this of the Republican irregular resistance to the treaty. And so, in that sense, a kind of sense of this is what's going to allow us to continue. There is some evidence. Some people say that most people in Ireland were supported the treaty, or at least supported it just because there was hovering over this the possibility that the British may, in fact, start it again. One of the reasons they bombarded the four courts is because Britain was pushing them to, especially after the assassination of Henry Wilson in London. So there was that kind of necessity in some ways, bowing to that kind of necessity. The other side has been accused of a kind of deification of the Republic, a kind of spiritual kind of connection to the Republic that warranted this kind of rebellion and this kind of war. So yes, I think it's probably more. I guess what's interesting then is it's not that easy to say there's two visions. It's much, and what's something we don't like to know is that things are difficult, and things are process of creating a new state here is difficult, and people have visions of what it might be, and the need for the Republic. That is the essential part of being Irish or Ireland, and others trying to figure out how to do this, given the situation that they're in. So in that sense, I guess, yes.
And we should probably point out that this is the first in three, and there are others, but three major partitions that the British take part in the early half of the 20th century. Ireland, which results in a civil war that lasts less than a year. India-Pakistan, in which 1 million people are killed, and Israel-Palestine. The politics of decolonization, the politics of British withdrawal in the early 20th century were extremely messy. And we could say that the Irish Civil War is an event in Irish history, but I think it's very important to point out that it is also an event in British history. As Salman Rushdie always says, the British are ignorant of their own history because so much of it happened elsewhere. It's a throwaway comment, but it's a very smart throwaway comment because it was Salman Rushdie. And so it's a civil war that is, in one sense, uniquely Irish, but in another sense, it is the opening salvo in a whole series of wars of decolonization and independence over the course of the 20th century. It's part of that whole long history.
Mm-hmm. At one point, I want to go back to a little bit to the the issue of archives and pension records in particular. I have a student who's working on, PhD student, who's working on African American veterans in the Union Army trying to get their pensions. And he's working on actually the lawyers who represent them. And an important thing to remember here is that people are trying to get something. And so they're trying to project something in some ways, and they have to build a case. And a case that these bureaucrats, the United States starts to become bureaucratized, really, in the post-Civil War era, and the creation of the pension program is part of that bureaucratization, that these bureaucrats have to be convinced to be able to give you that money, and especially the difficulty of convincing them that these African-American men should get their pensions, and who you bring in as a witness or get witnesses for them. So there's a lot of these letters that are very moving and powerful, but we should also think that there's a lot going into these pension files that is aimed at to see if I can actually get this money. A little story on this, I think, is, again, I mentioned a couple of grandfathers that I had. My grandfather, Dennis Meagher, I'm convinced he got his pension. He was a bootmaker. He was his nephew was a bootlegger, and not his nephew. One of his sons was a bootlegger, and the other one, my grandfather, defended bootleggers. But he was a bootmaker, and somehow he got a hold of some money, and I think it's because he got his pension. And he opened a saloon, and the story goes on from there. Produces a son who becomes a lawyer and an alderman, and that's the growth and then the decline in the recent generation. But in any case, the importance of getting that kind of support, and particularly when you would think of African American men and the need for that. So how does this work? But the point is well taken in this, and as Colleen said, the number of sources that tell us about average people, how they live, what they think, is tiny, and it's very, very difficult to recreate that, the lives of regular folks, and the importance of these kinds of records.
Should we open it up
sure.
to the audience for questions?
First of all, thank you for an education in history. The only war I knew about concerning Ireland was the brutal strife in Northern Ireland, which came much later with England. A couple of comments and questions. I couldn't help making a comparison with our own Ken Burns' epic on the Civil War. One of the most moving things in that epic, I'm not comparing the lengths, that was for 12 chapters or whatever. But one of the most moving things in Ken Burns' Civil Wars was the reading of the letters. And I found the same thing in this movie. I found the reading of the letters, various letters concerned people who fought in the Civil War, an extremely moving experience. You had quoted William Butler Yeats at the beginning in the introduction. I was wondering whether the redoubtable James Joyce had anything to say about this Civil War. And another question I have is, did this Civil War have any bearing on what came later in Northern Ireland? And lastly, I just want to mention, you mentioned the last point, the British Empire and the mess they have left everywhere. The Indian parliamentarian Shashi Tharoor has written a brilliant book called Inglorious Empire, and it's been making the rounds, something worth reading.
Can I steal a story from Ambassador Dan Mulhall? He's not here. No, he's not. He's in Boston right now. I thought of it as this film was going on. Forgive me for stealing this story, but you'll find it interesting because when he was in India, somebody came to his office and made a request for a state pension from the Irish state on the grounds that he had been imprisoned by the British for having translated Dan Breen's account of the first shots of the War of Independence. which brings together, not just I think, the very idea that a state should be responsible to its citizens for, for supporting revolutionary activity, but also the idea that these are the first shots in the Irish Civil War are also the first shots. James Joyce, no, very little to say about the Civil War, like many else. There is a great book, actually, if you're interested in Irish writers and the Civil War by Nicholas Allen, called Modernism something and Civil War. Modernism, Civil War in Ireland. But Joyce had very little to say about it. I think in part he had published Ulysses and was moving on to works in progress and was at the very beginning of Finnegan's Wake. So there wasn't a whole lot of output from him at the time. I'll leave you to talk about maybe the letters and the sort of the Ken Burns effect.
Well, other than having, I was at the National Endowment for the Humanities when we funded that program. Other than having also being kind of affected by it, and it was a very powerful program in terms of the United States. It did far better than any other television program, documentary of its kind, up to then into the history of American television. Very powerful. And the letters were really important. Sullivan O'Ballou letter in particular, that is spoken during that program. Anybody? Yes.
It's not a subject that I have any great expertise on, but following up on some of this discussion, wasn't it the case that subsequent to the Irish independence, that huge interest was shown toward that example and lots of going back and forth in the rest of the British Empire among Indians and other anti-colonialists using the Irish as an example? And my understanding was that there was lots of communication, some degree of communication back and forth of anti-British colonialism forces elsewhere in the world with the Irish revolutionaries to see them as an example.
1916 as a sort of a glorious failure was very popular as a spectacle, and historians writing right now, working on the global Irish Revolution, have written some really interesting stories about 1916, the War of Independence. I will say that the Civil War did not have the kind of deadening effect that one might expect on independence movements. The Civil War was never as widely represented, was never as widely written about or taken up because it was difficult. Because you could admire 1916 and you could admire the War of Independence, but then when it breaks down, it becomes difficult. I realize that we didn't answer your last question about the contemporary sort of afterlives, essentially, of the Civil War and the effect that has on Northern Ireland. Tim, I'm sure you have something to say about it. As I was watching this film earlier this week, I could only think that the very current debate that's happening on Brexit and the border, that is the lingering aftermath of the War of Independence, the treaty, and the Civil War. That, again, this is an example of British history happening elsewhere. And they're being unaware of it, entirely unaware of it, if you listen to the Rees-Moggs and the Boris Johnsons of this world. So the and ill-defined nature of the border, even after the Boundary Commission of the late 1920s, which was to set the border, but essentially said, we'll accept what there is, the ill-defined nature of the border and the ill-defined nature of the sovereignty of the North and the Republic has been hanging over Ireland and, to a certain extent, Britain since then. I mean, this is a continuing chapter in the Civil War, essentially. As Ferreter and others pointed out when we were thinking about commemoration, how difficult commemoration became, especially as the IRA, the newer IRA, became politically and militarily active. The idea of commemorating independence became an embarrassment to the state.
Just a couple of things. One on back to your question, and again, I'm going to use the American context. When the Irish Americans were involved in the kind of nationalist cause after the World War I, and the first big issue was the League of Nations, whether the United States should sign a treaty that would include the League of Nations. and Irish Americans opposed it, thinking that it would mean that the United States would have to, including Irish Americans, it could be called in by Britain to put down rebellion in Ireland. But other things that they bothered them and were that it might be, the League of Nations might be a vehicle for imperialism around the world. And so they enlisted people. The person in charge is a guy named Frank P. Walsh, a kind of great labor radical in the United States, who enlisted his friends in the United States to speak for Egypt and for India to Congress against the League of Nations. But there were also very close ties between the Friends of Irish Freedom in the United States and the Indian movement for freedom, and also Korean movement for freedom. They all had ties, and a lot of them came through the United States. So there were these other kind of connections that had been developed.
So one of the things that struck me just seeing the archives was something that's been more recent, which is the Boston College records of the IRA and the Loyalists, and the question of when is the right time to actually release these records and allow them to be out, and some of this conversation about the stories that are going to come out now 100 years later about, well, you know, there's a history of informers, and there's a history of people and family stories and those pieces that come out, and so I was wondering, you know, how does it feel in the sense of can you be releasing this too soon and letting people know these things too soon, and does that make it harder to repair the wounds?
Well, I know of the Boston College and situation, but I don't think I know enough to be able to tell you about how that was done. Running in archives, we ourselves have records that are not that are closed for a certain amount of time. Some that you may think they're not nearly as dramatic, I think, as the Boston College archives. But we have anthropological records, done contemporary or relatively contemporary anthropological records that were done that we cannot release. We received those records. They're the records of an anthropologist who interviewed people here in Washington, and we have to keep them closed. We set a certain date as to when they could be open, because we are assuming that all the people who were interviewed would be dead by that time, so that we could not allow them to be open. There are other kinds of records, those kinds, that we have also closed. So it's a kind of careful process of trying to determine, make sure that there's a privacy to those people, because these records, this information was given with a kind of notion of confidentiality, and so it's we would try to protect it. But that's a good question. When should we know? Well, I mean, that's how much is going to hurt those people, or people that are connected to them, or people mentioned in them who are still alive, compared to what the need to know, how much it helps the nation itself or the people itself come to grips.
Can I give a slightly sideways answer to that question? It's a great question, and I'm also not actually familiar enough with the Boston College archive to be able to speak to it. But I was thinking this morning about the question of the long memory or lack of memory of the Civil War, and I was thinking particularly about my grandfather, who. So I will freely admit I'm in my early 40s. I shouldn't have a grandfather who was in the War of Independence. That was 100 years ago. I just happened to be the youngest son of very large families. But there is a sort of a lingering familial politics in Ireland. We see it here. people who call for Michelle Obama to run, or maybe somebody called Clinton. But in Ireland, it lasts a very long time. So you think about Erskine Childers, who was a gun runner, a great novelist, executed during the Civil War. And then his son, 50 odd years later, it was 50, it wasn't that long ago, but anyway, becomes the president of Ireland. Eamon de Valera, clearly on one side of the war, and 10 years later becomes the Taoiseach, or well, at that point, the president of the council. You could think of Cosgrave, the Cosgrave family. You have them, number one, in 1923, saying he would execute 10,000 people if that helped, and then becoming a Taoiseach much later. And so maybe the question of when the boxes can be opened is a question that becomes slightly strange when you realize that there are just the same families being run through politics over and over again. The boxes could remain closed, and that particular problem of memory and a sort of a ghostly recurrence, the spectre that haunts Ireland, that particular problem would still be there, strangely. So even though we talk about the Civil War being forgotten, there's also a sort of a lingering familial memory of it, strangely, in Irish politics. So that was a weird answer, but it was a very good question.
I was kind of struck about how they commemorated the 50th, with the militaristic tone to it, and then 75th with poetry. Kind of threw me off there. But so only 2-3 years hence. What's your literature professor per se? So what do you anticipate 2-3 years hence with the centenary coming up? How is Ireland going to commemorate?
Poetry. maybe novels, drama.
But that was not a commemoration of the Civil War.
No, yeah.
That was a commemoration of
Yeah,
1916.
there have been no
Yeah.
there have been no commemorations of the
Or
Civil
remembrances,
War
probably,
or remembrances.
Right.
There have been no remembrances besides smaller local, maybe a little bit easier because you can say, well, this person,
Right.
or memories to particular atrocities or memorials to particular atrocities. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I, in a less optimistic sense, I mean, there was a lot of sort of self-back-clapping going on there, but Ireland has come a long way, it can now. But I do actually think that there's been a good bit of practice since 2016, and that that practice has all been leading up to 2022, 2023, and that there may be a reasonable discourse around understanding this particular Civil War, but also realizing that it is not unique to Ireland. It's not something that we need to constantly be dealing with, and that in fact it can become part of history rather than part of memory. And if there's a way in which a sort of an occluded memory of Civil War gets externalized into history, then that might be a good outcome.
Thank you very much for those insights. Really appreciate it, and for those good questions. Thanks again for coming out. Just two things. Look at our website, solasnua.org, for events coming up in the latter part of May and June. And as you go out, there are some tickets on a table up there for a concert this Friday. Is it here? Here by NYU. It is the One World Suite. And with this ticket, you can scan it and get free admission to that concert. So take a look on your way out. Thanks again. Thanks to you.